So tonight's message is going to be Godly Men Assume Responsibility. I was thinking about a lot of things, but one of the things that really goes against responsibility is being passive, right? Just kind of not really caring much about God's work, who we are as men, but that's not us, right? We are men that assume responsibility. And there's a question that I always like to ask: at what age do we become men? And specifically, what age do we become godly men? That's a little different probably for every one of us. There's something else called the Peter Pan principle. It's when you never grow up into being a man. You just always stay a boy, as Peter Pan was. And there's people we know like that, but again, that's not us, right? We are men of God. I think the answer to that question about when do we become men is when we take on man responsibilities. These are important. Least of which is our faith in Jesus. Where is our heart with God, right? As a godly man, it needs to be heading in the right direction. Our faith journey is more about journey in the Word than it is about destination, right? So we want to make sure that journey is headed in the right direction. Of course, there's milestones, but it's that journey that's important. So these are some questions you can ask. Am I closer to Jesus this year than I was last year? Am I headed in the right direction? Have I experienced Jesus in greater depths this year than I did last year? Am I headed in the right direction? Paul in 1 Corinthians 13:11 says, "When I was a child, I talked like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put away childish things and put them behind me." So Paul, in the context here, not to take it out of context, is talking about love specifically. That it's the greatest gift of all, that we should mature in comparison to all else. Because all the other spiritual gifts will fade away. He says, but love will last forever. So as you think about this, think about your maturity in love. A transition from immaturity, from a boy, to spiritual maturity, a godly man. Am I in love with God more this year than I was last year? Am I loving my neighbor more this year than I was last year? How about my wife? Am I loving my wife more this year than I was last year? Or how about my kids? Same question. Am I loving my kids more this year than I am last year? Ephesians 6:4 says, "Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and the instruction of the Lord." Are you loving your children as you bring them up? Are you training them in the instruction of the Lord? Are you loving them more, or do you tend to criticize more? Do you build them up, or do you tear them down? The one thing that they really want from you as a father is that they want to know you as a father, as a good father. Just as we know the Father is a good father, we too are a good father to our children. Do they feel truly known themselves and loved unconditionally by you, by their father? I think that's one of the greatest stewards that God gives us, is our children. And then if you're lucky like me, you have grandchildren, which you get to rile up and like a bee's nest and then get them all sugar high and send them off to their parents. Or get toys that really make a lot of noise, really disruptive. That's fun too. Here's a hard one. Am I loving my enemies more this year than I did last year? At least that's a hard one for me. Matthew 5:43 talks about Jesus teaching us to love those who hate us. You have heard that it said, you must love your neighbor and hate those who hate you. But I tell you, love those who hate you. Respect and give thanks for those who say bad things to you. Do good to those who hate you. Pray for those who do bad things to you and make it hard for you. You know people like that? I do. Then you may be the sons of your Father who is in heaven. His sun shines on bad people and on good people. He sends rain on those who are right with God and on those who are not right with God. If you love those who love you, what reward is that? And what can you expect from that? Do not even the tax collectors do that? If you say hello only to the people you like, are you doing any more than the others? The people who do not know God, they at least do that much. You must be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Now that Greek word for perfect could be translated mature or complete. It has that idea that basically as Christ's power works in you and becoming more mature, more complete, every year you're going to be able to love your enemies more and more and do good to those who hate you. That means you're coming closer to the end of your spiritual maturity. We're only going to get so far this side of heaven, but God does expect us to be heading in that right direction. When we take on manly, godly responsibilities, sometimes we think that maybe we're 18 years old and that we've arrived. But I know people, including myself, one of those late bloomers, when it came to spiritual maturity. I don't think I grew up till I was like 45. Had a long ways to go. Here's some practical implications that we can think of. One is emotional maturity. Men on average, believe it or not, 85% of men have an anger management issue. I certainly did. And I had to get a hold of it. It came out with my kids. We lived on a farm, and I think I expected that I was the employer and they were the employee. And so I expected them to be employees, not kids. So I noticed I started to blow up a few times a day when we were doing chores. And pretty soon I said, well, I'm just going to apologize. And every time I do that, that'll probably be a good deterrent. Well, after 5 apologies a day, I figured out I must have a problem because this is not getting very good. I'm not progressing in the right direction. So I sought help through prayer, through godly men, and through a few programs. And God blessed those efforts in my life. And I still, like an alcoholic, I still have an anger situation, but it doesn't come out. God just holds it right there, and then it diffuses. And God blesses those efforts when you deal with them. But you have to deal with them. You can't just let them continue to march. They'll destroy a lot of things in your life, including your relationships. So how do we understand and manage our feelings? Those things we should give daily to Jesus. Do our emotions rule us, or do we kind of rule over our emotions? Allow Jesus to work in our life to heal those areas. Do we take responsibility for our own actions and lives without blaming others where we're at in life? So this is another issue. You know, I did a message here a few weeks ago about healing, and one of the things was for 30 days, Lord, ask where you could be healed. And the Lord revealed to me that, thanks to my wife who pointed this out, I have a tendency to blame others. And she caught me red-handed, being Adam, trying to kind of twist my way to blame her for something that was my responsibility. It was a button I had, and I owned that button, not her. So thankfully, God's been working in me to deal with blaming others. It's very easy to do, for me anyway. So we take responsibility to live independently. That's another thing, right? There's a long time we live under our parents' roof or under someone else's situation, and we're dependent on them. But, just as God called Abram out of his homeland and sent him out into a land he didn't know, he had to depend on God, but he had to be independent of his parents and his family, basically. So God wants us to live independently and not to be codependent on others, only to be dependent on him. Choosing the right career path, working hard. You may have to take jobs that treat as beneath you or taking on multiple jobs. But, God expects us to carry our own burden, not to be at a point where we're overburdened. That's different. But there's a certain burden in life that we have to carry, and we have to man up for that. Ask God to help you in this, to be a hard worker if that's your situation. Financial management, that's the responsibility that you don't spend more than you make, and you deal with your money wisely. Another one that's a big issue that hurts a lot of men is having sex before marriage. Once you're a parent before you're married, it's a big handicap because a lot of times there's just too much overwhelming responsibility that comes with that God only intended when two people become one through marriage. Having babies out of wedlock can be a huge challenge that you don't need at that time of your life, besides being disobedient to God's word. Don't be afraid of doing things you don't especially know. So if you feel underqualified, that a lot of times is a good thing. God calls a lot of us, and he always calls us unqualified. If you feel like you're qualified, you might have to check your pride box because you might be just having a little issue with your pride. I remember when I graduated from college, I thought I was God's gift to construction. And I was pretty arrogant. And it took me a while, after enough failures, that I humbled myself and kind of said, I guess I got a lot to learn. So it was humility. Most of the times, employers will train you on the job if you're a man of character. Do things like show up early, leave late, help out extra, build others up, and don't complain. I remember one employer I worked for him free for 2 weeks just to show him that I could work hard and there was no commitment on their part. We're looking at this book called The Man Code, and basically in this area of responsibility, he gives two biblical characters to look at. One is Jesus, washing the feet of the disciples, and the other is Boaz in the book of Ruth. So we'll look at Jesus washing the disciples' feet, John 13. It's amazing that, Jesus, here he is, God himself, who came down to be a servant, right? That was what he was. He was a servant. And that's the heart of Jesus that he's trying to reflect into us, that servanthood. So in John 13, they were having the Passover. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them till the end. The evening meal was now in process. So he got up from the meal. He found out basically nobody's going to wash our feet. When you're sandals and you're kind of barefoot, so to speak, but you're wearing sandals, but your feet get dusty. Didn't have paved roads. Your feet get dirty. And so it's kind of a custom there to wash your feet. And usually they had a servant to do that. But in the upper room where they had the Lord's Supper, nobody was there to do that. And so seeing that nobody basically was going to do it, Jesus got up, took his outer clothing, wrapped a towel around his waist, and he poured water into a basin and began to wash his feet of the disciples, drying them with a towel that was wrapped around him. So you notice that basically the meal was already taking place. Nobody steps up to wash the feet. None of the disciples stepped up, right, to wash their feet. So Jesus himself gets up and washes the feet. Notice what he doesn't do. He doesn't blame others for not getting up and washing the feet. He doesn't complain on Facebook about how rude people are when it comes to foot washing. He doesn't just say, fine, I'll just wash my own feet. These guys could deal with it. Jesus takes on responsibility of a servant role and accomplishes what should be done. God himself in human form does this lowly task of foot washing. And so basically then, when he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes, returned to his place, and he said, do you understand what I've done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and that is right, for that is what I am. But now that I, your Lord, your teacher, have washed your feet, you should also wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Truly, truly, I say to you, no servant is greater than his master, nor a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. So all these things about taking responsibility is a blessing. It gives you a purpose, right? A man without a purpose is a very unhappy person. The worst thing in the world is to be bored and just to be passive. So Jesus assumes this responsibility that's usually left for the servants. His greatness, no one's greater than Jesus, did not prevent him from carrying out this lowly task. It was basically his greatness was expressed in servanthood. So real men, they don't run from responsibility. Like Jesus, real men, they assume responsibility. The other example that the book used was the story of a man named Boaz. If you're familiar with Ruth, you know Boaz. Basically, the whole story goes in the days of the judges. There was a big famine in the land, and so a man named Elimelech was with his wife Naomi, who's kind of the center stage of this story, and his two sons to live in Moab for 10 years. Moab's just right next door to Israel, Judah, actually, in the south end, and it's the next nation over. And apparently they didn't have a famine, so lots of food. So they headed over in that direction. However, Elimelech dies, and Naomi, with her two sons, stay there, and they marry Moabite women, two women called Orpah and Ruth. After 10 years, Ruth's two sons died, and they just left the women, Ruth and Orpah and Naomi. Ruth decides to go back to her native land in Judah, but tells her daughter-in-laws, stay here in Moab. This is where you're from. Don't follow me. She was also a little bit bitter because of all the men in her family had died. She kind of felt like God had forgotten about her. And so Orpah kissed them goodbye, but Naomi clung to her. And in Ruth chapter 1, you may have heard this basically at weddings and so forth, but Naomi said to Ruth, you need to go back to your people, go back to your God, and go back with your sister-in-law. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you, because where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So basically, Naomi returns to Judah, back to where she was from, and these women, so two daughters-in-laws and Ruth, arrive in Jerusalem area in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. Now comes in Boaz. Boaz was a very rich, wealthy person, owned a lot of land, and it was harvest time. And part of the deal in Israel's commandments from God was to leave corners of the field and don't glean them. Leave that for the poor. And so Naomi and Ruth start to glean the fields, and Ruth remembers Boaz, and being women in those times, especially in the time of Judges, it was a very unruly time. You were, pretty vulnerable as women. And so they came to Boaz's fields feeling they might be safe. And And so basically, Boaz takes notice and said, who's those two women over there that are gleaning the fields to his servants? And he goes, well, that's Naomi and Ruth, and they came in from a distant country, and they've been very hard workers. And so Naomi, in her mind, what she had was called a kinsome redeemer idea, right? And it really wasn't an idea, but it was a tradition, again, given by God, that if a woman is left without a husband, that as a kinsman, next in line, you were to take him and take care of him. And so Boaz wasn't really the next in line, but he was related to him. So after he notices Ruth gleaning in the fields, he goes over and says, hey, stay here and glean in this field. We'll keep you safe. My servants will watch over you. And Boaz goes to the city gates, and he tells the legal kinsman redeemer that Naomi's in town. So, hey, do your thing. And when he was told that she had land, LKR, that's the legal kinsman redeemer, LKR agreed to purchase. He's all happy. That's great. We'll get her land. But then when Boaz explained that she also had Ruth, then he backs out of the deal because he didn't want some foreigner to be part of his family that might inherit his stuff when he died. So Boaz then kind of thinks about this and goes, basically having a little conversation with God and making some thought processes, he steps up, okay? And he blesses Ruth, both physically and accepting her on the Jewish nation as a new member of God's covenant people, because remember, she was from a foreign land. And Boaz blesses Ruth in this chapter 2, Ruth 2. He says, after all that you've done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been fully reported to me. So I understand that. How you left your father and mother in the land of your birth and came to a people that you did not know. And the Lord rewarded your work. And may he also take his wages full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under the wings you've come to seek refuge. So this was very comforting to Ruth. A lot of times foreigners weren't welcome. And especially women, being very vulnerable as single women. And so when the men of Boaz saw this, they urged him to go beyond and above his duty, so that basically Boaz became Ruth's kinsman redeemer, a position he wasn't legally required to take, but he just stepped it up a notch. And this involved a significant financial commitment on his part. He would buy Naomi's land and agree to care for her as well as Ruth. And in the end, he actually married Ruth. And I'm sure they lived happily ever after. But one of the interesting things is they did have a son, and that son was a direct descendant of King David, who was in the line of Jesus. So all this was an interesting orchestration that developed and pushed down through the line of Jesus. Today, you might say that the whole world stands in desperate need of men who do more than just take care of themselves. America needs men who stand in the gap. We need men who do not only fulfill their duties, but to go beyond and above what their duty is. We need men like Boaz. America and the world are starving for men who will see a need, they'll stand up to it, and assume responsibility. We see that we need men with an obligation as a starting line, not just a finish line. Real men assume responsibility. So I ask this question, who will stand in the gap? God asked this question during the Israelites' captivity by the Babylonians, when they destroyed the city of Jerusalem and took away the Israelites in captivity. They tore down the walls of Jerusalem. Ezekiel 22, God asks, I looked for someone among them who would build up the wall and stand in the gap before me on behalf of the land so I would not have to destroy it. But I found no one. So the question remains, that is till Nehemiah, right? Sometime later. Nehemiah stepped up. Are you a man who accepts responsibility? Are you heading in that direction? Are you a man who sees a need, and rather than wait for someone, do you step up? Are you a man who bridges the gap between people and God to stand in that gap? Do you intercede in prayer for people? That's the question. Are you a man who will stand in the gap for Jesus?